Welcome everyone to the Willows Park Perspective. I am Will Nord, the Executive Director of the Willows Park Preserve, and I will be your host today. Each month we hope to provide our audience with an informative program that creates more awareness about our young nonprofit located in the Willows Park in Villanova, Pennsylvania. In 2017, a group of area residents came together and formed our nonprofit and named it the Willows Park Preserve. After seeing the Willows Mansion close for 8 years, our founders wanted to revitalize and reopen this beautiful and historic home and give it back to the community for everyday use. In 2019, the Willows Park Preserve entered into a 25-year lease with Radnor Township, and we began our journey. Today, we're happy to welcome Phillip Archer to our program. Phillip is the Betsy Babcock Deputy Director of Reynolda House Museum of American Art in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. That's actually why we're coming via Zoom today, because Phillip is down in Winston-Salem. So welcome, Phillip. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Will. Thanks for the invitation.
So Phillip, I just shared your title of Deputy Director of the Reynolda House. Can you back up just a little bit and tell us a little bit about where you're from, where you grew up, and maybe some professional experiences before you became Deputy Director?
Well, this conversation is kind of a homecoming for me because I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and have some connections along the main line. My grandfather was director of the main line YMCA when it was in Ardmore. I believe it's in Berwyn now, but my father was raised in Ardmore, then got a degree in engineering and took a job with Armstrong in Lancaster and worked his entire career with that one company. So we often travel the Lancaster Turnpike to see family in Westchester and go into Philadelphia. So I certainly saw beautiful estates on the way, but didn't really understand much about them. It's been interesting of late to learn more about the cousin properties that we have between the main line and here in North Carolina. I attended Wake Forest University, which brought me to North Carolina, and I was interested in publishing and worked for a poetry press, but I think I fell in love with the gardens of Reynolda and the grounds and the woods and the architecture of the place. And probably subconsciously, some of the architecture here in the barns and in the house reminded me of Pennsylvania. We can talk about this in more detail, but Charles Barton Keene was looking to vernacular styles, looking to old stone barns in Pennsylvania, and translated that to North Carolina in a way that made it feel natural, made it feel kind of this place. But for Pennsylvania boys like me, it also reminded us of home.
Great. It sounded like you stayed down in North Carolina after attending Wake. So tell us a little bit more about your role as the Betsy Babcock Deputy Director. How long have you been in this role? What do you do?
I've been with Reynolda since 1997 and in this role since 2016. And I worked with the curatorial team in creating exhibitions. Reynolda was a 1,000-acre estate, and in order to preserve as much of that land as possible, the second generation of the Reynolds family invited Wake Forest College to relocate from 100 miles east of us, near Raleigh, North Carolina, to actually relocate onto the estate in order to preserve some of the acreage as green space and with an educational mission. So Wake Forest actually was transplanted onto the Reynolda estate. And then the house itself found new life as a museum of American art in the 1960s. And the art is displayed throughout the historic rooms. They're period rooms with the original furnishings, but there also is a survey of American art history going all the way back to the 1750s in the rooms. And then in 2005, we doubled the size of the museum by adding a new exhibition building, an education building. So we have changing exhibitions all the time. There's always something new in terms of the art experience. So my team works on curating the exhibitions, installing exhibitions, and then leading tours and creating programs in order to foster conversations about art and history.
How many members do you have on your team?
Full time, I believe we're 9 or 10. In my small team within the museum, the full museum has a staff of 27 full time and about 50 part time staff working across the front desk and facilities and security throughout the 70,000 square foot museum. And then in terms of the historic district, there are 168 acres that we still interpret as the gardens and grounds of Reynolda as a historic district. Wake Forest is, as I said, on the estate, but in terms of what looks like the way it should have looked back in 1917, 1918, that still remains about 168 acres.
So maybe some audience members are questioning right now why are you here? What is the connection, right? There's a fascinating history that you're going to get into in a few minutes, but the short of it is, you've already mentioned his name. The connection between Reynolda and the Willows Mansion is Charles Barton Keene. I guess the biggest connection. I'm sure there's a few more similarities and connections that we can get into as well, but there's the connection. So Rose Garland, which was the original name of the Willows Mansion, which most people are familiar with that name, was designed by Charles Barton Keene, who also designed Reynolda House. So there's some really neat, as you put it, kind of cousin houses or connections between the two that I'm excited to hear from you in a few minutes. But to start, I wanted just to give a little snapshot, like a little 1 minute, 2 minute brief history of the Willows Mansion. And I'll kind of go first, and then if you have anything to add about the Willows Mansion, please add your thoughts and your expertise and knowledge. So for our audience, Charles Barton Keene designed, and the Willows Mansion was built in 1910. Charles Barton Keene was from Philadelphia. He designed, and the house was built for John Sinnott, the son of Joseph Sinnott. If our audience is probably fairly familiar with Rosemont College, and that beautiful mansion that is the admissions building now was the Sinnott family home. The Sinnott families were whiskey distillers. And so in 1910, John Sinnott built the Willows Mansion, named it, not the Willows Mansion, but named it Rose Garland, and he built it as a wedding gift for his wife. Quite a wedding gift. And his wife was originally from California. And so if you even look at the Willows today, that is where the terracotta roof tiles come from, kind of the smooth white stucco exterior, and then also the ironwork. There's quite a few iron balconies at the house today, as you can see it. There was also some other well-known designers besides Keene who worked on the Willows Mansion, including Thomas Sears, who was the landscape architect. Samuel Yellen did a lot of the ironwork that I just mentioned on the property. They still have an office. I still think they work out of Philadelphia. I know they have an office in Bryn Mawr. And Henry Chapman Mercer, who provided a lot of the tile work for the home. And many people in this area, or maybe across the country, are familiar with the Mercer Tile Museum in Doylestown. The Willows evolved, obviously, over time since 1910 and changed hands, family hands, more than a few times over the years, the last homeowners being the Zanzinger family. And then in 1973, the property was sold to Radnor Township for the purpose of open space, coming from the Mainline Times, an article of the Mainline Times in 1974. And then, of course, there's a long history of Radnor Township owning the building from the 70s up until what I mentioned in our introduction, when the Willows Park Preserve, our nonprofit organization, kind of took over the restoration. So Radnor Township does own the whole 47.5 acres of the park. They do own the actual building, but our nonprofit is in charge of the restoration and kind of the revitalization of the mansion itself to provide great programming and community events for everybody in the greater Philadelphia area. So, Phillip, what else do we need to know about the Willows Mansion, kind of the history or some other fun facts that you might know?
Well, Charles Barton Keene, I think there are traits that you see at Willows and at some of the other mainline properties that he designed that carries forward to North Carolina. And when he did come to North Carolina, he designed Reynolda and about 18 buildings on this property, a church, schools, the barns in the village, cottages for the employees. So he had a huge commission here that kind of gave him a new calling card for a sort of second phase in his career. And that led to a bunch of other commissions, dozens really, around Winston-Salem, Charlotte, Greensboro. He briefly moved here. His wife didn't like it as well as Philadelphia, so they turned and moved back up. But Keene went to the University of Philadelphia. He was there just prior to the architecture school being established, but pretty quickly made a name for himself. He was published in House and Garden quickly after graduation. A number of houses published in books and magazines that Catherine Reynolds would have consumed. Catherine married R.J. Reynolds, 30 years her senior, by far the wealthiest individual in North Carolina. When the income tax came out, he paid twice that of the second taxpayer below him. So Catherine Reynolds had resources. She was young. She was 24 years old. She was interested in agriculture and in trying to uplift farming in North Carolina, which at this point, almost every acre was turned over to the cash crop of tobacco. And Catherine really cared about diet, cared about health, wellness, and wanted to create a farm at Reynolda that could demonstrate to everybody in the region the variety of foods that we could grow in North Carolina and the fact that we could have safe, healthy milk. So she turned to these magazines, turned to these books for an architect that might be able to fulfill this commission. And in Keene, she saw somebody that was a master of a lot of historical styles. This wasn't an era where architects were trying to create something brand new. It was an era where they were reviving historic styles and doing it with a lot of accuracy. People were traveling more at the turn of the 20th century. They were looking at magazines with full photography and reproduction. So the clients had new expectations that things would be accurate. So you mentioned the mission roof and those nice Juliet balconies at Willows. There was an attention to detail that she saw in Charles Barton Keene. So she not only brought Keene to be her architect, but Thomas Sears, whom you mentioned was the landscape architect at both locations. Yellen did the ironwork at both locations. So I think there was that attention to detail, that historic grounding, that mastery, but then also an avoidance of ostentation. She read that Keene managed to make big houses feel smaller than they were. So they called a lot of these houses stockbroker Tudor because they were in this historic English style, and a lot of stockbrokers were building them along the main line. But what Keene was known for, apparently, was that he could balance a modesty with a large scale. And that's exactly what Catherine Reynolds wanted. She wanted a bungalow. It turned out to be 30,000 square feet. So it's the largest bungalow in the world. But they always called it the bungalow.
That's interesting. Actually, I was not really familiar with how Charles Barton Keene was attracted down there, pulled down there to do that project. So that was some interesting information that I was not aware of. And even with, while Reynolda is significantly larger in so many ways than the actual Willows Mansion, I understand that I believe the Willows Mansion is 13,000 square feet. But that vibe of, when you look at it from the outside, it looks pretty big, right? Not like a, house that I'm used to going into every day. But when you do go inside, there is this, it doesn't feel as big. And we've actually heard that from some visitors saying, oh, I thought it would be bigger inside when I saw it from the outside. So if that was Charles Barton Keene's goal, the way he designed homes, he nailed it. There definitely is this like a cozy vibe, a smaller vibe when you walk into that house. I think that's interesting to think about. So, well, you've already really started telling a little bit about the background of Reynolda and the history. And a lot of our audience are not really familiar with Reynolda. So fill us in a little bit more. Fill us in more on the history, when it was built, kind of what it started as. You talked about it a little bit with Catherine, her thoughts, but provide us a little bit more background and history of Reynolda House, please.
I probably should say a little bit more about R.J. Reynolds. Between where you're sitting and where I'm sitting, in the 1750s, they started a wagon road. So the Great Wagon Road from Philadelphia through the main line, through Lancaster, came all the way down to Salem. And that led to a lot more trade between Pennsylvania and North Carolina. It also led to migration of Moravians. So Salem was built by Moravians in the mid 18th century. And then Scotch-Irish people made that trip. So the Reynolds family came down through Virginia to southern Virginia to establish a large farm in southwestern Virginia, where R.J. Reynolds was born. He had a number of brothers, and as a young man, felt the need to break out and establish his own business and his own fortunes. Based on the knowledge and the skills that he had learned on that farm and the tobacco operations that they had there. So he came to Winston 1875, sometime in that year. The town had 443 souls at Winston. It was just a blip on the map. But Salem was really well established, and it was very well known for education. So it was a place where families throughout North Carolina and Southern Virginia would send their daughters, especially. So the country's longest running college for girls is here at Salem. R.J. Reynolds admired that Moravian work ethic, admired the dedication to education. And the soil here was evidently propitious for tobacco. So he started a company, and it grew in his lifetime 90-fold. So it was the largest city in the state by the time Reynolda was built. And Camel cigarettes came out in 1913. So as I mentioned, Catherine Reynolds had a dream of a country estate that would be an idealized kind of community. And dozens of families lived on the property and worked the farm, worked the dairy, but it's significant that not a leaf of tobacco was grown here. So it was all about what country life could provide, the beauties of country life, the healthfulness of it. And that speaks to the kind of house she wanted, because a bungalow is, at least at that time, of all forms, the one that is most associated with breezes coming through the house, with the kind of permeability of inside and outside. So if you're in a bungalow, you're usually a few steps away from a porch or a veranda. They're sort of engulfed in porches. And that's a healthy living kind of statement in itself. The estate was developed then. Really, you mentioned Willows was completed in 1910. Keene begins designing for Reynolda in 1912, so almost immediately after. And the white stucco from Willows reappears throughout this entire district. The roof tile turns green, so they're shingle rectangular tiles, not the barrel mission tile roof. The ironwork, it all reappears. And that super group of Keene, Sears, and Yellen all work together on this entire property as well.
So there's the similarities with Yellen and Sears and Keene. Anything else? Any other similarities between the properties, or the design, or the actual house?
Many visitors through North Carolina will stop in Asheville and visit Biltmore, which is the house that launched 1,000 country houses. Biltmore was completed by George Washington Vanderbilt in 1895, and it remains the largest house in this hemisphere. But it inspired a lot of other successful tycoons and industrialists to create their own idealized country estates. people will visit Biltmore and then visit Reynolda and say, I could actually imagine living at Reynolda. It feels warm, it feels domestic. You use the word cozy. I think what the two houses have in common is a sense of proportion, and the proportions that are actually right for our embodied experience. So that speaks to Keen's real grounding in history and his travels in Europe, and he knew the proportions that just seem right, and even in our peripheral view. So that's not to denigrate Biltmore, which is an incredible experience in itself, but you have the feeling that you're in a palace or something that doesn't necessarily take our small lives into account. It feels scaled at a heroic scale, whereas these houses truly are of the family, or they have a friendly sort of feeling despite their scale. I also, when I visited Willows in March, just before everything collapsed, March of last year, I went down in the basement and saw a streamlined modern bar, a curved sort of 30s bar.
Yeah.
And essentially both properties have almost identical curvilinear home bars, which make you feel like you're on a ocean liner in the 30s.
Yeah.
It has that style. So I don't know the story behind the bar at Willows. Reynolda, the fortunes of the Reynolds did not ebb during the Great Depression because people kept smoking and going to movies and drinking too. So maybe that's why there's a similar bar at Willows.
Yeah, that's an interesting connection. I haven't been at the Willows Park Preserve for too long, so every day is a learning experience, and one of the most fascinating parts of my role, my job, is to find out the history of the Willows Mansion, and I'm learning something new every day. There were not a whole lot of historical records for us. The Radnor Historical Society and even the Lower Merion Historical Society has pitched in, and local individuals, and just kind of providing us piecemeal information here and there. Actually received some great information from Vassar College that ran the Vassar designer showcases out of the Willows Mansion, and they just recently, in the last month or so, provided us with some great history and some great pictures. So I look forward to learning more and more about the Willows Mansion and Reynolda, and seeing more and more connections. I think the more we learn, I think the more we'll see how we're fairly closely connected. So we don't have much time left, but tell us what's new going on at Reynolda. I know there's one more similarity that a project we just completed that you guys are just kind of starting. Can you tell us about your roof restoration project?
Yeah, in the middle of the night when I have anxiety about replacing this entire roof, I think about your project that's successful last year. But Reynolda's roof is 105 years old. It's a very well-built house, and it shows that more and more over the decades. But some recent investigations have shown us that the wood underlayment below the tile is compromised in some places. So we went through a long process of thinking about fixing it or replacing it, and have decided to go back with a brand new roof, but in the exact same colors and manufactured by the same company. So both roofs were made by the Ludowici Company of Ohio, and they're happily still in business, and they're really committed to historical accuracy. So we have really debated what color green this is, and it turns out, and Keen was so specific, it's 3 different shades of green. And we've talked about green plus a couple of years of bird activity, what that would turn into. So it's been a real process, but happily the community here, as well as the National Endowment for the Humanities, have supported the projects. We're ready to start in just a couple of weeks. And it's 78 tons of Ohio clay that we'll be removing and replacing. That's the equivalent of 13 adult elephants, we've learned. But it's going to mean that the collections that Reynolda has, the art collection, the furniture, will have a greater protection for another century. So we're excited, and again, we're reassured by the success at Willows of your project last year.
It was a big project. It happened before I came on board, but the founding members, the board members, We had a very generous, supportive, anonymous donor. There was a lot of people that contributed to our brand new roof. And I'm sure it wasn't without a few hiccups, but the final product is beautiful, and you can see it from far. And we just wish you the best of luck on your project. Is there any end date do you know, any for your roof restoration?
December 31st, and since the roof is coming off, this is the chance to do some work in the attics. So there are 11 air conditioning systems throughout the house, and 3 of them are up in the attics. So we'll be replacing them at the same time. Some other, all the guttering will be replaced and the downspouts. So, yeah, you were wise to come in just after the project was done. That's the way to take it down.
Maybe I was a little lucky for that to happen. We're almost out of time. I mentioned this at least once already. I look forward to the future relationship between the Willows Park Preserve and Reynolda on so many levels. And we're actually going to continue that relationship or maybe begin it, or I could say continue it, where we're going to have a virtual field trip with Reynolda members on July 22nd. So I guess Reynolda members will come virtually into the Willows mansion and be able to see the inside of the home and hear about what we have done, what we're doing, and what we plan to do. So we're excited for that virtual field trip coming up in July. Anything else? Any parting words from you down in Winston-Salem?
Well, soon enough, we'll be able to actually visit in person, and I recommend a couple days in Winston-Salem if anybody's heading this way, because historic Salem itself is one of the best preserved 18th century villages in the country. So the main area of Salem, buildings have been preserved or rebuilt, reflecting a kind of Germanic village in the mid 18th century, and they still bake the sweets and the cookies the way they once did in the same ovens, and there's costumed interpreters, and it's an extraordinary sight. And then at Reynolda, of course, you have all this acreage of beautiful gardens, and the village has been restored as shops and restaurants. So I invite you to spend a day at each place.
And can you share your website at Reynolda for our audience, please?
Reynolda.org. So it's Reynolda. It's Reynolds, but feminized, because really this is a woman's vision and a woman's creation. So it's the Reynolds family name, but with an A instead of an S.org.
Well, great. Thank you, Phillip. We appreciate you for joining us today from down in North Carolina. If you want more information on the Willows Park Preserve, our website is www.willowsparkpreserve.org. So thank you all for joining us today. We hope you can join us next time.